Spider-Man 3 is probably the superhero movie that over the years has received the most negative attention, both when it came out and in retrospect. I remember I was working at a movie theater back in the day, and people hated this movie. People were shitting on it, people said it was terrible. Now, I live in Canada, so the main reason people gave is there's a scene near the end where Spider Man jumps in front of an American flag. And because Canadians have a pathological hatred of America, that was the primary reason they would give. So if you ask them why this movie was so bad, some of them would say there was too many villains, but generally speaking, people would complain about the American flag. So yeah, this movie's received a lot of hate. Sam Raimi said a bunch of things that he thinks it was really bad, that he thinks it was terrible. People have endlessly criticized this movie. I know back in the day I was on board with the whole haterade, partially just because I was really liberal back then, and I also was shitting on it 'cause the American flag, I'm sorry to say. But I rewatched it with Serpent Trillion the other day, and I realized I was completely wrong about this movie. This movie is actually really good. Is it as good as the previous two movies? Not quite, but I don't think that's Sam Raimi's fault. Serp was telling me a bit, and I watched a couple videos about his plans for this movie. It seems like almost all of the bad aspects of this film were editorial mandates that the studio forced upon him, and that Sam Raimi didn't want to do. Now, I read something that he did want to maybe introduce another villain along with Sandman, but he said in videos that he doesn't want to use characters that he doesn't understand. He said, I have no idea who Venom is. I have no idea how to write Venom. I mean, clearly, if you watch the first movie, he understood Norman Osborn very well. He understood Otto Octavian, Doc Ock, very well. He understood Harry. He understood Peter. People have told me that the weakest part of the main cast is probably Mary Jane, and that particularly in this movie, her personality and Gwen Stacy's personality are switched. And I just kind of have to take people's word for that because I haven't read any of the comics. So, but the point is, Sam Raimi, generally speaking, has a pretty good understanding of the characters, and he didn't want to add in Venom, and you can really see that. And where this movie really starts to develop problems isn't even till the last 75, the last quarter of the film. The first 75% or so is very, I think, solid. I mean, people complain about emo Peter, people complain about Peter being a dick, and that it's cringy. But the other movies in this series have all kinds of cringy stuff too. The first movie has the high school scenes. The second movie has all the scenes of Peter being a loser. Being cringy is kind of part of these films because they're very much like a coming of age story. And that's kind of Spider-Man is this kind of duality of he's really confident and like wisecracking and stuff as Spider-Man, but he's kind of a loser as Peter Parker. So while like some of it maybe I guess you could argue went a little far, it was fun and it was memeable. And as I've said, I think the worst thing a film can do is to be boring. Is to be boring in a very mediocre way. And you can say a lot of things about Spider-Man 3, but you can't say it's boring or dull. Like I said though, I think the first three quarters of this movie were pretty solid. Even then, you can see some studio mandates. I think Gwen Stacy was forced into this movie. I kind of attribute whatever problems this film has to studio meddling with it. Like the symbiote Venom shows up in the first like half of the movie or whatever, but it's completely superfluous. It just is kind of there and it's given as an explanation for behavior that could have just been Peter going off the rails because of the way his life was going. And you could just say that it was unnecessary. But like towards the end, it just crowds up the frame a lot and it's so dense. There's so much going on. But overall, there's a lot of good things about this movie. Once again, the action scenes are really good. The humor is good. It's very memeable. It's very fun. It's very exciting. There's lots of crazy stuff that happens in it. There's a lot of good character arcs that get completed. In particular, Harry's character arc, I think, is completed in a very satisfactory way. Peter's does with forgiving Flint. Once again, you could probably argue that Mary Jane is the weakest part of this movie, but a lot of the other character arcs are pretty strong. So I'm okay with it. So overall, I think it's actually a pretty good movie. Someone told me there's a Sam Raimi cut that someone edited that removes most of the studio mandated stuff. That would probably also just help the runtime and get it down a bit. I don't mind films having a long runtime. I just think the longer it gets, the more you have to justify it. And this one's a little long. Not bad or anything, but just a little long. So that being said, let's go into it. So from my understanding, this takes place, I think, 2 years after the events of Spider-Man 2. And Peter's gone through a lot of character development in that time. Spider-Man is bigger than ever. He's more or less gotten his life on track. His photography job is going better. He's acing his courses and in class. He has a stable relationship with Mary Jane. And to top it off, he's going to propose to her to marry her. So everything seems to be going awesome. There's some really, really good Aunt May scenes in this. I think the Aunt May scenes are all probably the best character moments. All of the speeches she gives to Peter are great. The interaction between them is really heartwarming. I think that's something you can say for Sam Raimi. He does a really good job of mixing drama, camp, and genuine heartwarming moments. I find there's a certain Shakespearean tragedy to a lot of the characters, and we really see that in this movie a lot with Harry. So once again, I as I said, I think these are better than like any of these films are better than all of the Marvel movies, if only in terms of writing. Even with all the editorial mandates, I take this over any Marvel EU movie any day of the week. But I digress. So he goes to talk to Aunt May. She gives him her wedding ring and tells him to use it to propose to Mary Jane, which I think was very sweet. There's a funny scene later on, which I'm sure certain is a reference to Lord of the Rings, where when he's battling Harry, the ring slips out of his pocket, and there's like a shot by shot recreation of Peter grabbing for it, just like Gollum grabbing for it at the end of Return of the King, which I thought was kind of a cute reference, and I was kind of happy to see it there. So it's two of my favorite trilogies of all time, and it's nice to have those kind of little references. So, anyways, while this is going on, Harry and the previous movie found out that his father was the Green Goblin. He takes the gas that his father took in the first movie to give him superpowers. Although in this case, it doesn't make him go crazy. I think the gas had like a 10% chance or something of making you go crazy. And in Norman's case, it did. In Harry's case, it didn't. So Harry builds a new version of the glider, which is kind of like a snowboard or a skateboard. It looks like a snowboard. He has his own version of the Green Goblin costume. Now, a lot of people have said that it looks kind of lame. It's not as cool as the glider. I think it might be a little more practical than the glider, just by virtue of it probably being easier to control and it taking up a lot less space. So it can probably go some places where it didn't. I mean, you can criticize it. Harry isn't his father, though. He's kind of like younger and hipper and stuff. So it kind of makes sense that he'd come up with his own thing. I don't really mind it. It's fine. It's it's something a little different. I'm not going to criticize a movie for trying to do something a little different if it largely works. We get a really awesome scene of Peter and Harry fighting. As part of the fight, Harry gets hit um, and almost dies. Peter takes him to the hospital, where it turns out that he's developed amnesia. Now, amnesia is something you have to be very careful with in movies because it can very easily be a plot device. In this film, it's not really used as a plot device to kind of fill in the blanks or to like solve some plot element. This film's all about completing character arcs, and the amnesia is used to show that deep down, the three friends from high school do deeply love each other and do deeply care about each other. That without all the nonsense involving Harry's father, without Peter being Spider-Man, without, like I said, all this just stuff in the background, ultimately Harry and Peter were best friends. And those feelings are still down there, very deep. I find the relationship between them kind of interesting. I can't think of too many examples of this, but oftentimes I find in literature you'll have like the Chad, because Harry's a Chad, and not exactly a sidekick, but he has like a best friend who's not really an alpha male, but is like a really reliable delta male who's like smart and stuff. It kind of reminds me of the Robert Ned dynamic, a bit, but I really do like the relationship. I think Toby and James Franco have good chemistry, even if it is like obviously like Harry's kind of like this Chad alpha male and Peter's kind of a delta male, but I do think there's some chemistry there, and it is really like I said, Shakespearean tragedy when like Harry wakes up and Mary Jane and Peter are there, and Harry's like, "I'm so glad to see you guys. You guys are my best friends in the world. It's really great to see you here." Um, and we kind of have some scenes where Mary Jane and Harry are interacting, and Harry and Peter are interacting, and it's back to how things were. It's back to when things were good and they were young and happy and that kind of thing. And you can really feel the sorrow come off the screen as they're talking to Harry, and so that's a good scene. So like so far we're like, I don't know, half an hour into the movie and things are going pretty well. I haven't really seen anything that's particularly bullshit. We also have Mary Jane has her Broadway musical debut. She completely sucks in it, and she gets fired, and then she has to become a waitress slash singer at a restaurant. We're also introduced to Flint Marco. Now, Flint Marco is the actual person who killed Peter's Uncle Ben. It wasn't actually the guy who died in the first movie. It was Flint Marco, and we're kind of introduced to him, and he's kind of a sympathetic villain character because his whole crime career is his daughter has some sort of really bad illness, and he needs a lot of money to treat her, and that's kind of why he turned to a life of crime. And he broke out of prison specifically so that he could try to steal some more money. And early on in the movie, he gets trapped in a particle accelerator and it merges him with sand and he becomes Sandman. So he can absorb sand to like change his size. He's immune to most forms of damage. There's kind of a cool scene later where Harry hits him with an explosion and it like turns his arm to liquid glass. The special effects on him look amazing. They still look good to this day. He's a good villain. From my understanding, he was supposed to be the main villain, but Venom was shoved in at the last minute. I just don't know what the climax of the movie would have been if Sandman was still the uh the main villain, because Sandman's not really like the Green Goblin or Doc Ock who have like some big evil scheme that that's Peter has to foil at the end of the film. But this is Sam Raimi, so I'm sure he could have come up with something. So all that stuff is happening. Sorry if I haven't gone further. There's a lot of stuff going on in this movie. They cram a lot of things in. So we are introduced to Gwen Stacy, played by Bryce Dallas Howard, who I've always found to be a pretty attractive woman. Um, the thing is, her personality and appearance are better than Mary Jane's. So you kind of wish Peter would just dump Mary Jane and go with Gwen Stacy instead, which is kind of one of the weaknesses of this film. Peter goes to he saves Gwen Stacy's life. Gwen Stacy's the daughter of, I think, the police commissioner, but she knows Peter from their science class. So they have like a celebration of Spider-Man, and she gives him a kiss in the same way that Mary Jane gave him a kiss in the first movie, which is really scummy on Peter's part. He doesn't see that as like cheating on her or ruining something that was just between them. And yeah, Peter is just getting really, really arrogant. He's like, I'm Spider Man, I'm awesome. To be fair, he's probably earned a certain degree of arrogance, but pride precedes the fall, as it were. The symbiote possesses Peter's suit. It makes him a lot stronger, but also makes him more aggressive and arrogant. He catches up to Flynn in a subway channel and actively tries to kill him. He manages to wash Flint down a. He opens up some water. It turns him into mud or whatever you call wet sand, and he gets taken out to the lake or the river or whatever. So Peter thinks he's killed him. He goes back to Aunt May, and Aunt May's like, "I don't think we have the right to decide who lives or dies." And I'm just like, "No, Peter was justified in killing him. It doesn't really bother me, to be honest." We're also introduced to Eddie Brock. Now, from my understanding, this is really bad casting. I haven't read the comics, like I said, but apparently Eddie Brock is supposed to be like some super buff Chad. I mean, they got Tom Hardy to play him in the Venom movie, and they get like this like guy who's kind of a bitch to play him. He's not even that he's a bad actor; he's just really poorly cast. So he's Peter's rival, and Jameson says he'll give the staff reporter to position to whoever can catch Spider-Man committing a crime. So Eddie Brock winds up doctoring a photo in like early Photoshop or something to make it look like Spider-Man committed a crime. And then Peter goes and publicly exposes him. And Eddie like begs him not to. He's like, "Please, Peter, I'm never gonna get another job in this town again." And it's just like, are we supposed to feel sorry for him? Are we supposed to think that this is bad, that Peter's acting out of character? I mean, the dude doctored a photo. He slandered Peter. He lied. Like, he took the job that was Peter's by right because he had loyally served Jameson for years. Like, he was a disgrace. Like, it's hard to be a disgrace to the journalistic profession, but I guess he was. So I don't really get like why it if we're supposed to feel bad for him or we're supposed to think that Peter did something wrong by calling out this piece of garbage. But apparently that's kind of what happens. So Peter becomes the staff photographer. Um, there's kind of a cool scene where they later in the movie where Eddie goes to a Catholic church and asks God to give him the ability to destroy Peter Parker. There's a scene where it looks like Mary Jane and Harry are going to get back together, but then something happens and they don't. Then Harry gets his memories back, and he convinces Mary Jane to break up with Peter. And then Peter brings Gwen Stacy to the club and starts like, and does it just to humiliate her. And he gets his suit and does the Joker dance. I mean, people want to like attack those scenes. They are goofy, but they're a lot of fun when like Peter's doing the dance and like the Joker dance and acting all confident and stuff. So I'm going to give it a pass. So Harry lies to Peter that he's back together with Mary Jane at his apartment. Peter and him get into a big fight. Peter beats the crap out of him and tells him that his father never loved him. He thought he was a retard and a failure. So they're fighting. Harry throws a pumpkin bomb at Peter. Peter like beat the crap out of him, and then so yeah, it beats the crap out of him, tells him his daddy never loved him, and as he's leaving, Harry throws a pumpkin bomb at him, which he reflects back and it blows up Harry's face. Once again, are we supposed to like think Peter did something wrong here? I mean, Harry was trying to kill him. It like I don't get how that's even bad. He threw his like the pumpkin bomb was meant to kill Peter. Or like was Peter just supposed to let it hit him? I guess he was supposed to throw it like out of the way or something. But Harry's got this big facial scar, and I think he's blind in one eye. But as with males in general, facial scars just kind of make you look more Chad rather than making you look ugly. So Peter realizes the symbiote is corrupting him. We get a cool scene where Peter goes to the bell tower of a Catholic church and finds out that sonic power it finds out that like sonic ringing disrupts the symbiote, and he pulls it off himself when it falls down the bell tower and corrupts Eddie Brock. Now what's interesting is when Peter wore the symbiote, it made him more powerful and it made him aggressive, but he didn't have like the Venom powers where he could create like whatever it is Venom has instead of webs. He couldn't do like the stuff that Venom could do. So my thinking is, and this is not very well explained, that the Venom symbiote is evil, and the amount of power and the amount of compatibility it has with its host is based on how evil they are. It takes the inherent negative feelings of the person and magnifies. Now, Peter is a fundamentally good person, but it exploited his jealousy, his pride, um, and some of his resentment towards the world. But like all of these were pretty mildly negative emotions that most people have at some point in their life. So while it made Peter into a bit of a dick, it didn't really make him evil or anything like that. Whereas Eddie Brock is a fundamentally like scummy person, so the symbiote was able to completely assimilate with him and make him like super powerful. So Venom and Sandman decide to team up because we need a climax, and they kidnap Mary Jane as a way to draw out Spider-Man. So Peter's like, I can't beat these two guys on my own. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go and ask Harry for help. And he's like, look, Harry, I know you hate me, I hate you, but we gotta save Mary Jane because she's innocent all. And Harry's like, fuck you, you hurt me because I was trying to kill you and you knocked my own bomb back at me. You're like a big meanie. You killed my father, who was a psychopathic mass murderer. And then he leaves, and we have the worst scene in this entire film where his butler, like who's not even really been a character before now, is like, yeah, Peter didn't actually kill your father. The wounds were made by his own glider. I never told you before now because of reasons, I guess. I don't like, I don't think there is really reasons that are ever provided why he didn't say before now. He's just like, it's just so lame. My understanding is in the original movie or the edited version, he just stares at a picture of him, MJ, and Peter together, and he finally lets go of his father's memory. He finally lets go of his resentment, and he realizes that the people who have always been there for him and the people he really cares about are Peter and MJ. I think this would have been a really good time to have a scene where he talks to, because he periodically sees his father's ghost. If his father's ghost comes up and he finally tells him off and he's like, look, Dad, you're dead. You made your decisions. I have to be my own man. That sort of thing. And then he finally like abandons his quest for revenge. But he goes to help out Peter, which is awesome. And I love it when heroes and villains team up. It's always cool. It's one of the reasons why Terminator 2 is so good. Because Arnold was like the badass villain in the first movie, and then he comes back as the main, as like a good guy in the second movie. So we get a series of just awesome fight scenes. I think the coolest part is when Harry throws bombs at Sandman, and it like melts him into molten glass and stuff like that. It's really cool. But ultimately, what happens is we kind of have a redo of the first movie, where Venom has tied up Spider-Man and he's gonna stab him with the glider, and Harry jumps in the way and takes the wound, and it's a fatal wound in the same fashion as his father. Peter remembers that sonic frequencies are the way to beat Venom. So there's kind of a cool scene where he puts a bunch of metal pipes in the ground and hits them, and the ringing noise causes the symbiote to separate from Harry. He grabs one of the pumpkin bombs and throws it at the symbiote. Eddie Brock, though, has become addicted to it, and he jumps in to try to save the symbiote, and they both get killed. Then we have a scene where Peter finally confronts Flint, and Peter's kind of gone through his hero's journey, and he's kind of more mature now. And Marco tells him that Ben's death was an accident to a certain extent. He had kind of got distracted or something and wasn't trying to shoot him. I don't know. It kind of doesn't make a ton of sense, but and that it haunts him every night and says, everything I've done was to try to help my daughter. I don't really care what happens to me. I just that. And then Peter decides to finally let go of all the guilt and resentment and pain he's been holding in for Uncle Ben. And he forgives Marco. It's a very touching scene. And Marco kind of escapes, and it's just a very nice scene because like the wind, he just dissembles himself into wind and blows away, which I think is, like I said, a very nice scene. Then we have a another very touching scene, which honestly kind of I almost tear up just thinking about it, where Harry, who's dying, confronts Peter and MJ. And once again, it's kind of an end to the whole character arc that I think is quite satisfying, where they've been fully reconciled. It's back to how it was at earlier in the series, where the three of them are like best friends. They're really close. All the shit they've done to each other, all the hatred, all the resentment is gone. Harry dies, but he dies fully reconciled to the only people in the world that he actually loves and cares about. And he doesn't die alone. He doesn't die in a disgrace. He dies having saved Peter and done something of value with his life. And like I said, I find it very touching. It's a good conclusion to the character arc of all three of our main characters. And it is a very satisfying ending. There was going to be a fourth movie, which actually sounded really good, but it never came about. Even so, this was an okay ending to the series. The Venom thing, I think, just kind of detracts for it. It just kind of makes it a bit too busy. But overall, there's a lot of things to like about this. This is a really solid film on the whole. I haven't seen the director's edit, but I'm sure like it fixes a lot of the problems. So that's Spider-Man 3. Is it as good as Spider-Man 2? No, but Spider-Man 2 is probably the best comic book film ever made. So it's kind of hard for anything to live up to that. I'd probably give this like a solid 8 out of 10. Um, if its flaws had it been ironed out a bit more, this probably would have been as good as Spider-Man 3. I'd say it's maybe, I don't know how to really compare it to Spider-Man 1 because Spider-Man 1's a pretty different film. But it does resolve all the character arcs, it ties up all the loose ends. Overall, just a really good film and completely not deserving of any of the hatred that it gets. So that's all I have to say. God bless, and we'll talk to you real soon.